The unexpected call the night was quiet in Sundar's California home, the kind of silence that presses against the windows and makes every little sound feel sharper. The city outside had gone to sleep, the streets dim, the air cool. Sundar had been sitting alone in his study, staring at a pile of notes he had no reason to read anymore. He had done this many times, returning to old memories of his first days at Google, when nothing was certain, when the future was only a shadow of possibility. He liked those moments because they reminded him of humility. They reminded him of the small flat in Chennai where he grew up, of the long nights with no air conditioning, of the way his father would read the newspaper out loud as if the world could be carried into that tiny room just by the sound of his voice. But tonight, Sundar's calm was interrupted. The phone rang. Not his personal phone, not his work phone. It was a special secure line, one he rarely used and never at such an hour. He froze. Only a handful of people knew that number. His first thought was that something terrible must have happened to someone close. He reached for it slowly, his fingers trembling before he even answered. "Mr. Pichai," the voice said, urgent, clipped, almost metallic, as though every word was pressed through layers of static. "You must come to Geneva, immediately. It is a matter of national consequence." The words hung heavy in the air. Geneva, national consequence. Sundar felt a cold ripple run down his spine. He asked who was speaking, and the reply was softer but no less severe. "You will understand everything when you arrive. Minister Jaishankar is already being briefed. You must stand with him." Sundar's heart raced. Jaishankar, the foreign minister of India. What could possibly connect him, a man of diplomacy, with Sundar, a man of technology? Sundar had stood on stages across the world, but those were different. He was used to product launches, lectures, conversations about the future of artificial intelligence, not matters of national consequence. "Why me?" he whispered, almost to himself. But the line had already gone dead. He sat still for a long time, staring at the phone as if it would explain itself. Then his mind went into a quiet storm. He thought of his childhood again, of the way his father saved for months just to buy their first telephone, how something as ordinary as a rotary dial had felt like a miracle. And now here he was, a man whose phone had just pulled him into something so vast he could not see the edges. He rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window. Outside, the moonlight stretched across the hills, soft and silver. He knew he could say no. He had every right to stay out of politics. But deep inside, something stirred. He remembered the lessons of his mother, who always said kindness was not just about small gestures. Sometimes it was about stepping forward when no one else wanted to. Hours later, as dawn barely touched the horizon, Sundar was on a plane. He watched the clouds drift below him, endless and white, but his mind refused to settle. Reports were already flooding his inbox. The summit in Geneva was not just another gathering. It was being described as the most tense and fragile meeting in years. Leaders from across the world were expected to attend, and behind every handshake was a storm waiting to break. The documents he read made his chest tighten. The American President Donald Trump was preparing to push a radical proposal, one that would cut India out of key global deals. The excuse was economic balance, but Sundar knew from experience that such moves were rarely so simple. Isolation was power. Exclusion was control. And suddenly, Sundar understood why he had been called. Trump was not just attacking India's position with diplomacy. He was attacking India's story. And who better to defend that story than a man who embodied it? A man who rose from a modest life in Chennai to stand at the helm of one of the most powerful companies in the world. Sundar realized he was being summoned not as a CEO but as a symbol. Still, fear weighed on him. He was not a politician. He was not trained to argue across microphones with presidents. What if he failed? What if his voice shook? What if the world saw him as weak? He closed his eyes and tried to rest, but memories came rushing instead. He remembered the first time he had left India for America. The way his parents had hugged him at the airport, holding on for longer than usual, as though they were afraid to let go. He remembered the loneliness of that first winter, when he had no warm coat and no money to buy one, until a classmate lent him theirs with nothing more than a smile. He remembered how that kindness had carried him further than he ever imagined. The plane touched down in Geneva under a gray sky. Rain clung to the glass of the terminal and the air felt heavy with anticipation. Officials whisked Sundar through corridors and soon he found himself in a small, dimly lit room. There, standing, tall and composed, was Jaishankar. The minister greeted him with a nod, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. "I am glad you came," Jaishankar said, his voice calm but edged with something urgent. "This summit will test more than policy. It will test our spirit." Sundar felt a strange comfort in his presence. Jaishankar carried himself like a man who had seen storms and learned not just to survive them, but to shape them. Yet even he seemed unsettled. "Trump has already made his position clear," Jaishankar continued. "He wants India isolated. He wants others to believe we are a burden. But this is not just about India. It is about the principle of respect. If India is cast aside today, tomorrow it could be anyone." Sundar nodded slowly. He knew this was true, and yet the weight of expectation pressed harder on his shoulders. "Why me?" he asked again, more directly this time. Jaishankar's gaze softened just slightly. "Because you are a living reminder of what India means to the world. Not just tradition but resilience. Not just history but possibility. When you speak, people will see more than a CEO. They will see what a boy from Chennai can become. And that is what they must remember when they cast their votes tomorrow." Sundar swallowed hard. There was no turning back. He realized now that his doubts did not matter. He had been given a chance to stand for something larger than himself, and he could not run from it. The hours that followed passed in a blur. Briefings, strategy meetings, quiet moments of reflection where Sundar sat alone, trying to imagine what he might say if he was called upon. Every time he thought of words, they seemed too small, too weak. But then he would remember his father, reading the newspaper, insisting that even the smallest voices mattered if they were steady. Finally, the moment arrived. The summit hall was vast, its ceilings arched, its flags hanging heavy above the long, polished tables. Cameras lined the walls. Leaders murmured among themselves, their eyes sharp, their tones clipped. Sundar walked in beside Jaishankar, feeling every gaze turned to him, and he knew immediately that Trump had seen him. The American president sat at the far end of the table, his posture firm, his face a mask of calculation, but his eyes locked on Sundar with a glare that was unmistakable. It was not surprise. It was recognition. It was challenge. Sundar felt his pulse quicken, his throat tighten. The hall seemed to grow darker, quieter, heavier, as though the air itself was waiting. He realized then that this was only the beginning. And just as he settled into his seat, trying to calm his trembling hands, Trump leaned forward, his voice sharp, cutting through the room. "So," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "they brought the tech boy." The words struck like a stone thrown into still water, ripples spreading instantly. Some leaders turned their heads, curious. Others shifted uncomfortably. Sundar's face remained still. But inside his heart thundered. The summit had not yet begun, but already the battle lines were clear. Voices clash in the summit. The room was heavy with silence after Trump's words. The summit hall, with its grand walls and endless flags, seemed to hold its breath. Sundar sat still, his hands resting on the smooth wooden table. Though his fingers wanted to curl into fists, his mind told him to remain calm, to breathe, to remember every lesson his parents had given him about patience. But the weight of those mocking words, the tech boy, echoed inside him, not just as an insult to himself, but to everything he represented. Jaishankar shifted slightly beside him, his calm presence like a silent shield. He did not react, though his eyes hardened as they glanced at Trump. He leaned just close enough to Sundar to whisper, his tone quiet but firm. "Do not let his words define this moment. He wants to shake you. Stay steady." Sundar nodded faintly. though his chest still carried the thunder of nerves. A bell rang softly through the chamber, and the summit officially began. Leaders adjusted their microphones, aides scribbled notes, and cameras focused tightly on faces that would soon define headlines across the world. The secretary of the summit spoke briefly about the purpose of this gathering: to decide on new economic alignments that could alter the balance of power for decades to come. Then Trump leaned forward again. His voice boomed with practiced confidence, each word delivered like a hammer on steel. "Let me be clear," he said, his tone rising. "The world has carried India long enough. They take advantage of trade, they refuse to open their markets fully, and they continue to act as if they are owed respect without giving it back. Today I am calling for this body to acknowledge the truth. India cannot be treated as an equal partner. It must be isolated until it learns." His words fell like stones, one after another, until the hall felt crushed under their weight. Sundar looked around, and he saw the reactions unfold. Some leaders nodded quietly, agreeing with Trump's accusations. Others frowned but said nothing. Many looked at each other, waiting to see who would speak first. Jaishankar kept his composure, his hands folded, his gaze fixed straight ahead, but Sundar could feel the tension radiating from him, the pressure of knowing that silence could mean surrender. Then, unexpectedly, Trump turned his head, his eyes locking on Sundar once more. "And here we have," he said with a smirk, "a man who built his fortune in America, not India. The irony is perfect. Your best and brightest leave your country to succeed here, and yet you still want to be treated as a global power. Maybe Mr. Pichai can explain why India deserves this respect, because I do not see it." A wave of murmurs broke across the hall. Sundar's stomach tightened. He had not been scheduled to speak, at least not in this opening session. He had prepared no speech. Yet suddenly all eyes were on him. Cameras turned. Microphones tilted. The entire world seemed to shift its gaze onto his shoulders. His throat felt dry, his heart pounding. He wanted to shrink, to disappear into the shadows of the room. He was not a politician, he reminded himself again. He was not trained for this battlefield. But he also remembered what Jaishankar had told him, that he was not there as a CEO, but as a symbol. Jaishankar leaned toward him, once more his voice low but urgent. "You must speak. If you remain silent now, the room will believe his story." Sundar's hands shook as he reached for the microphone. The metal felt cold, unforgiving. He took a breath, but the words would not come. The silence stretched painfully, and he could feel Trump's grin growing wider as if savoring his hesitation. Finally, Sundar began, his voice soft but steady. "I did not come here expecting to speak tonight," he said. "But since I have been asked, I will share something, not as a politician, but as a human being who has lived both sides of this world." The hall grew quieter, the kind of silence that bends closer to listen. "I grew up in a small flat in Chennai," Sundar continued. "We had little money. For years we did not own a car. We waited in long lines for basic needs. Yet in that small home with my father reading the newspaper by the window, I learned something that matters more than wealth or power. I learned humility. I learned kindness. I learned that respect is not something given to you by treaties or summits. It is something you earn by how you treat others." He paused, the memories flashing across his mind. His mother teaching him to share food even when there was not enough. His father sacrificing for his education. "India," he said, his voice gaining strength, "is not perfect. No country is. But India has given the world more than markets and numbers. It has given ideas, resilience, spirit. And millions of people like me carry those values into every corner of the world. That is not weakness. That is strength." For a brief moment, a murmur of approval rippled through the room. Sundar felt the weight in his chest lift slightly, but Trump leaned forward sharply, his voice cutting across the hall. "That is a nice story," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But stories do not build economies. Emotions do not protect nations. India has taken far more than it has given, and you, Mr. Pichai, are proof. You left. You built your life here, not there. Do not lecture us about humility when your own country could not give you what you needed. The words were cruel, calculated. Sundar felt them like blows, sharp and precise. For a moment, he faltered. But then Jaishankar spoke, his voice steady. "Commanding, Mr. President," he said, turning his gaze toward Trump. "You mistake migration for abandonment. Our people do not leave because they reject India. They leave because the world opens its doors to talent, and India has never been afraid to share that talent. Mr. Pichai is not proof of India's weakness. He is proof of India's gift to the world." The room erupted in murmurs again. Louder, this time. Some leaders clapped softly, others leaned back with thoughtful expressions. Sundar glanced at Jaishankar, gratitude flooding him, but the minister's face remained calm, unshaken, as if this was only the first move in a long game. The secretary of the summit tried to calm the hall, but the energy had shifted. For the first time, Sundar felt the possibility that Trump's certainty could be challenged, yet deep inside fear still coiled. He knew this was only the beginning, that harsher storms were coming. As the session paused for a recess, Sundar followed Jaishankar into a private corner of the hall. "You spoke well," the minister said, his tone even, "but this was only the opening. Tomorrow they will demand more, and they will not be gentle." Sundar nodded, his throat tight. "I do not know if I can keep doing this. I am not built for this kind of fight." Jaishankar placed a hand on his shoulder, steady, grounding. "None of us are built for it until the moment arrives. Then we discover who we are. Tomorrow, the floor will be yours. You must be ready." The words struck Sundar like lightning. Tomorrow, the floor would be his. Not just a few hesitant sentences, not just a response, a full speech before the world. That night, back in his hotel room, Sundar sat by the window, staring at the rain-slicked streets below. He tried to imagine what he would say, how he would stand against the storm that was gathering. His thoughts kept returning to his father, to those evenings in Chennai when the dim light of a single bulb was all they had. And yet it felt enough. He remembered his mother's gentle reminders that resilience was born not from grand victories, but from surviving small hardships day after day. And he realized that this summit was not just about nations or policies. It was about people like them, people who lived in small homes, who dreamed quietly, who wanted dignity and kindness to mean something in the world. He stayed awake through most of the night, words tumbling through his mind, shaping themselves into something larger than he thought possible. He knew he might falter. He knew Trump would try to break him, but he also knew that silence was no longer an option. The next morning arrived gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds. The summit hall filled again, the atmosphere more tense than before. Leaders took their seats, reporters adjusted their cameras, and everyone knew the weight of what was about to happen. The secretary announced the next session, and as expected, Jaishankar was called to speak. But then, in a move that stunned many, the minister turned to Sundar and said clearly, "Before I address this hall, I will ask Mr. Pichai to speak first." A wave of whispers surged across the room. Sundar felt his pulse hammering, his legs heavy as stone. But there was no escape now. He rose slowly, each step toward the microphone echoing louder than it should have. He placed his hands on the cool surface of the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and felt the silence tighten around him. Cameras focused, pens poised, every leader watching to see what he would do. And with a deep breath, Sundar began to speak. Sundar's speech that shook the halls. Sundar stood before the microphone, his breath shallow, his palms damp against the smooth wood of the podium. The silence in the hall pressed down on him like a heavy blanket, suffocating and unrelenting. Every leader in the room, every camera lens, every whisper of breath was fixed on him, waiting to see what he would do. For a moment he thought of stepping back, of letting Jaishankar take the lead, of escaping the crushing weight of expectation. But then he remembered the look in Trump's eyes the night before, that glare filled with dismissal, as if he were nothing more than a child, standing among giants. And something within Sundar hardened. He drew in a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried with an unusual clarity. "When I was a boy in Chennai," he began, I shared a single room with my family. There was no luxury, no comfort, only the basics that kept us alive. We did not own a car, we did not have many books, but my father had a radio, and he had his newspaper, and he believed those things could connect us to a world larger than our own. He believed that respect was not something you demanded with force, but something you earned through resilience, through patience, through kindness. A ripple passed through the audience. The story was not what they expected. Some leaned forward, curious. Others frowned, uncertain of where this would lead. Sundar pressed on, his voice steadying with each word. I stand here today not as a politician, not as a man trained in diplomacy, but as a son of that small room. I built my life because people showed me kindness when they had no reason to. When I first came to America, I had almost nothing. There were nights I could not afford food, days when I wore the same coat through freezing winters. But people helped me. Strangers shared meals with me, lent me clothing, guided me when I was lost. That kindness is what allowed me to succeed, and that kindness is what India has carried into the world for thousands of years. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the hall. He saw leaders watching him with softened expressions, as if caught between politics and memory. Everyone, he thought, had once been small. Everyone had once known struggle. India is not just a nation of numbers, he said. It is a nation of families like mine. Families who sacrifice so their children can study, who endure hardship with dignity, who carry respect in their hearts even when they have little else. That spirit has given the world doctors, engineers, teachers, artists, thinkers, people who build, not by tearing others down, but by lifting others up. That is India's gift to the world. The hall was quiet, deeply quiet, and Sundar felt the power of that silence. But then, just as he began to feel the rhythm of his words settle, Trump suddenly leaned forward, his voice loud, cutting through like a knife. This is all very emotional, Trump said, his tone thick with mockery. A sad story about a poor boy who made it big. But I am here to talk about reality, not fairy tales. Reality is trade. Reality is economics. Reality is that India takes far more than it gives. You stand here with American success, not Indian success. Do not confuse pity with respect. The interruption shattered the atmosphere. Some leaders shifted uncomfortably. Others looked down at their notes, afraid to be caught reacting. Sundar felt the heat rise in his face, the old doubt gnawing at him. For a moment he thought he might falter, that Trump had punctured the fragile momentum he had built. But then, deep in his chest, another memory rose. The first time he had spoken in front of his college class in India, his voice shaking, his words stumbling. He had thought everyone would laugh. Instead, one teacher had looked at him with quiet encouragement, nodding as if to say, "Go on, you can do this." And in that moment, Sundar realized he had been given the same choice again, to shrink or to stand taller. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice firmer now. "Mr. President," he said, still respectful but with a sharper edge. Respect is not measured only in trade numbers. Respect is measured in the lives we touch. When India sends its sons and daughters across the world, it does not lose them. It shares them. I may have found my career in America, but the values that shaped me came from India. Humility, resilience, respect. These are not products of an economy. They are the roots of a culture. And they are not mine alone. They belong to more than 1 billion people. A stir moved through the crowd again, this time louder. Sundar saw leaders whispering to their aides, nodding slightly, their faces shifting from skepticism to thoughtfulness. He pressed on, his voice now carrying a rhythm, each word stronger than the last. India does not ask for pity. India asks for fairness. India does not want to be placed above others. India asks not to be placed beneath. The future of this world will not be written by those who isolate others. It will be written by those who respect one another, who see strength in humility, and who believe that kindness is not weakness but the greatest form of power. The hall erupted in applause, not overwhelming, not unanimous, but enough to break the stillness that had held the room captive. Sundar felt the weight lift from his chest, though his heart still pounded furiously. But Trump was not done. His hand slammed against the table, the sound echoing like thunder through the hall. The applause faltered, silence falling once again. He rose from his seat, his face hard, his tone sharp. "If this summit is going to be about speeches and feelings," Trump said, "then count America out. I came here to make deals, not listen to bedtime stories about humility. The world must decide. Will it side with hard reality or with pretty words that mean nothing?" Gasps ran through the chamber. Aides rushed to whisper into ears. The atmosphere, once leaning toward sympathy, now spun into chaos again. Sundar felt his pulse race. He had spoken from the heart, and it had reached some, but Trump's threat carried weight. The possibility of America walking away could shake the summit to its core. Jaishankar leaned slightly toward Sundar, his voice calm, but urgent. "Do not lose your composure, this is his tactic. He will push, he will threaten, but you must hold steady. The room is watching not only what you say, but how you stand." Sundar nodded, though the pressure was almost unbearable. He looked out at the hall, at the eyes of the leaders who seemed torn between two worlds, the blunt force of Trump's threats and the quiet power of his own story. And in that moment, Sundar realized something chilling. The battle was no longer about words alone. It was about endurance, about who could hold the silence longer, who could stand taller when the air itself seemed to shake. He gripped the podium, steadying himself, and met Trump's gaze across the hall. The world waited, the tension coiling, tighter and tighter, until it felt like the room itself might break. Backroom struggles and secret deals, the summit hall emptied slowly after Trump's dramatic threat. Aides shuffled stacks of papers. Translators closed their headsets, and the echoes of restless whispers still clung to the air. Sundar felt drained, as though every word he had spoken had taken a piece of his strength with it. His body was stiff, his throat dry, yet his mind was louder than ever. Trump's table slam still rang in his ears, a sound that felt less like wood striking wood and more like a hammer against his own resolve. Jaishankar walked beside him as they exited the chamber, his expression unreadable, his steps calm. Sundar wanted to ask him if he had done well, if he had managed to shift the balance even a little. But the minister remained silent until they entered a quieter corridor. Only then did Jaishankar speak, his tone steady, as if he were carefully weighing every word. "You did what you had to," he said. "And you reached some ears. But remember, words are only half the battle in places like this. The rest happens behind doors that cameras cannot see." Sundar nodded, his chest tightening. He knew this was true, and yet the thought of secret negotiations unsettled him deeply. He had always lived in a world where problems were solved openly, where innovation was debated in meetings, where progress was measured in data. But here in this arena, power moved in whispers and shadows and smiles that meant something entirely different from what they appeared to mean. After a brief recess, delegations began moving to smaller rooms. Some doors closed quickly, guards stationed outside, while others remained slightly ajar, hinting at hurried conversations within. Jaishankar guided Sundar toward one such room reserved for India's representatives. The walls were plain, the lighting dim, but the table in the center was scattered with notes, reports, and cups of untouched tea. "There is something you must understand," Jaishankar said as they sat. "Trump is not working alone. Some nations are already leaning toward his proposal. They may not show it in public, but in private they are negotiating terms. They see an opportunity to gain favor by isolating us." Sundar felt his stomach drop. "But why? What do they gain from this?" "Power," Jaishankar replied simply. "Favors, promises, deals we may never hear about. Politics is rarely about truth. It is about what is convenient at the time." The words struck Sundar like cold rain. He thought of the leaders who had nodded at his speech, who had even clapped. Were those gestures nothing more than masks? Were they already planning to turn their backs once the doors closed? The hours that followed were a blur of hurried meetings. Some leaders came quietly to India's room, offering cautious words of support but stopping short of promises. Others avoided the room entirely, slipping past with their eyes downcast. Sundar noticed the patterns quickly. The nations with stronger economic ties to America were the most hesitant, their loyalty bending toward Trump's gravity. By late evening, exhaustion had settled into Sundar's bones. He sat in the corner of the room, watching Jaishankar move from one conversation to another with tireless precision. The minister seemed almost mechanical, his patience unending, his calm unshakable. Sundar admired him, yet he wondered how one man could endure so much pressure without faltering. As the night deepened, an aide entered the room with a small folder, his expression grim. He handed it to Jaishankar, who opened it silently. Sundar leaned forward, sensing something important. The minister's eyes narrowed as he read, his face tightening ever so slightly. Then he placed the folder on the table between them. Inside was a copy of a letter. Its words were blunt, stripped of politeness. It revealed that Trump's administration had been working for months to build a coalition against India, long before the summit even began. Promises of trade benefits had already been offered to several nations if they supported America's plan. Sundar felt the blood drain from his face. So this was never about fairness. It was decided before we even arrived. Jaishankar's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet fire. Yes, but knowing the game is rigged does not mean we surrender. It means we fight smarter. Sundar leaned back, the weight of the letter pressing down on him. For the first time, he felt a surge of helplessness so strong it almost consumed him. What could one man, one speech, even one minister do against an arrangement built months in advance? Memories crowded him again, his mother standing in their small kitchen, saving every grain of rice so none would go to waste, reminding him that even in smallness there was dignity. He remembered how she had once told him, "Resilience is not about winning every battle. It is about refusing to give up when everything tells you to." Those words flickered through his mind like a dim flame struggling against the wind. Later that night, as he walked through the dim corridors of the summit building, Sundar found himself alone. The hallways were eerily quiet, the marble floors echoing with his footsteps. He turned a corner and froze. 3 men stood waiting in the shadows. Their suits were sharp, their faces hard, their eyes cold with purpose. "Mr. Pichai," one of them said, his voice low but edged with menace. "We advise you to step back. This fight is not yours. You are a guest here, not a politician. If you continue, you will regret it." The words hit Sundar like a blade. He wanted to speak, to argue, but his throat tightened. He saw in their eyes that this was no empty warning. They were not asking, they were declaring. He stepped back slightly, his heart pounding, but before he could respond, the men turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as silently as they had appeared. Sundar stood frozen, his breath uneven, his chest heavy. For the first time since arriving in Geneva, fear gripped him fully. Not fear of Trump, not fear of the summit, but fear of being crushed in a game too large for him to survive. When he returned to the Indian delegation's room, Jaishankar saw his pale face and did not need to ask what had happened. He only said in his calm voice, "This is what it means to stand against power. It is never clean. It is never safe. You must decide if you are ready to carry this weight." Sundar sat down, his hands trembling slightly. He knew that stepping back was the easy choice. He could leave, return to his life, and no one would blame him. But deep inside, he also knew that if he left now, something in him would break forever. Night stretched on, the city outside silent under the weight of rain. Sundar sat awake, staring at the letter, the warnings, the shadows of betrayal. He thought of his family, of India, of the billions of voices that would never be heard in rooms like this. And he wondered if his own voice, small as it felt, might still matter. As dawn began to lighten the horizon, a new session of the summit was announced. The vote was approaching faster than anyone expected. Time was running out and the storm was tightening. The storm before the decision. The morning of the decisive session began with a sky that seemed to mirror the mood inside the summit hall. Heavy clouds pressed down on Geneva, muting the light, casting the city in a gray that felt almost funereal. Sundar stood by his hotel window, staring out at the rain-slick streets below, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Trump's glare, heard the words of the men who had warned him in the hallway, and felt the crushing weight of the letter that revealed the summit's betrayal had been scripted months before. His phone buzzed with messages, well-meaning notes from colleagues, cautious encouragements from friends in India, even a quiet blessing from his mother that read simply, "Remember who you are, Sundar." The words touched him deeply, yet they also sharpened his fear. Who was he in this moment? A CEO? A son? A symbol? Or just a man lost in a battle that was never his to fight? When he arrived at the summit building, the atmosphere was sharper, edgier, as if the very air had thickened. Aides moved faster. Papers shuffled louder. Conversations happened in huddled corners with voices lowered to whispers. Sundar felt eyes following him as he walked through the corridors, some curious, others cold, a few filled with something that felt like quiet expectation. Inside the main chamber, the seats were nearly full, and the tension was electric. Trump sat tall at his place, his hands folded on the table, his expression carved into stone. Jaishankar sat beside Sundar, his composure unbroken, his face unreadable. But Sundar knew the minister felt the same pressure pressing down on them all, as the secretary of the summit outlined the schedule. Sundar's thoughts drifted to a moment from his youth. He remembered being a teenager in Chennai, sitting for his first competitive exam. The power had gone out in the middle of the test, plunging the entire hall into darkness. Some students panicked, some gave up, but Sundar had kept writing by memory, recalling every page he had studied, every line his teachers had drilled into him. When the lights finally returned, he was still writing, still steady while others were broken. That memory, small and distant, whispered to him now, "Stay steady." Even in the dark, the session began with statements from various leaders. Some spoke, carefully, their words balanced, trying not to lean too far toward either side. Others echoed Trump's call for harsher measures against India, though with softer language. A few defended India, highlighting its role in technology, medicine, and global stability. Yet as Sundar listened, he could sense the tilt. America's shadow loomed over every speech, its weight bending the room closer to Trump's will. During a pause, Sundar stepped out into the hallway to breathe. There he encountered a small group of younger delegates, leaders from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, many of them in their 30s, some not much older than he had been when he first joined Google. They approached him hesitantly, but their eyes carried something he had not seen much in the older leaders. Hope. "Mr. Pichai," one of them said, her voice soft but steady. "What you said yesterday, it mattered. Many of us come from countries that know what it feels like to be dismissed, to be silenced. When you spoke of respect, it was as if you were speaking for all of us." Another added, "We may not have the same power as the larger nations, but we listen, and if you speak again today, we will stand with you." Their words shook Sundar more than Trump's threats ever could. These young leaders were not bargaining for power or deals. They were listening for truth. And in their eyes, Sundar saw his own younger self, the boy from Chennai, small and overlooked, yet dreaming of something larger. He returned to the chamber with their voices echoing inside him. For the first time since the summit began, he felt a flicker of strength that came not from strategy but from solidarity. Then the storm broke. Trump rose unexpectedly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. The secretary tried to intervene, but Trump spoke over him, his voice booming. "Before we proceed to the vote," Trump said, "I believe it is necessary to be honest about the man India has chosen to place at this table. You have all heard his speeches. You have all listened to his stories of poverty, humility, and resilience. But you should also hear the truth." A ripple of unease moved across the hall. Sundar's chest tightened. He could feel what was coming, though he did not know the form it would take. Trump held up a folder thick with papers. "This man," he declared, "built his empire in America, not in India. He profited from our markets, our systems, our people. And yet he dares to stand here and lecture us about India's greatness. What is worse, there are questions about his past, questions about his loyalties, about where his true allegiance lies. India sends us their brightest, but they do not return. They do not build India. They abandon it. Sundar Pichai is not a symbol of India's strength. He is proof of India's weakness. Gasps spread through the chamber. Cameras clicked furiously. Aides whispered in panic, and Sundar felt the ground shift beneath him. He had expected criticism, mockery, maybe even insults, but this was different. This was a direct assault not just on India, but on his very life, his very identity. His throat tightened. He thought of his father, who had worked long hours to save for his education. He thought of his mother, who had stitched every seam of his school uniform with care. He thought of his journey, not as an abandonment of India, but as an extension of it, carrying its values into new soil. But how could he explain this when the accusation was so sharp, so personal, so public? Jaishankar leaned toward him, his voice barely above a whisper. Do not let him write your story. Only you can do that. Speak, Sundar. Speak before the silence becomes agreement. Sundar gripped the edge of the table, his hands trembling. He felt the weight of a billion eyes, of his parents' sacrifices, of every young person who had ever left home to chase a dream, yet never stopped carrying their country in their heart. But there was something else inside him too. Something he had never spoken aloud, a truth he had kept private, buried deep because it was too raw, too personal. It was the kind of truth that could destroy him if twisted, yet it was also the kind of truth that could save him if spoken with courage. The chamber waited. The silence, thick. Every face turned toward him. Trump smirked, certain of his victory, certain that Sundar would shrink under the weight of accusation. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a breath that seemed to carry his entire life with it. He knew he stood at the edge of a choice. He could remain safe, deny, defend, argue with logic and statistics. Or he could step into the fire and reveal what he had carried alone for years. The truth that could change everything. The final stand, the chamber was so quiet that Sundar could hear his own heartbeat. It pounded in his ears, heavy and relentless, as if reminding him that this moment was not just about words, but about the very core of who he was. Trump's accusations still floated in the air, sharp and poisonous, and Sundar knew that silence now would be the same as surrender. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing from every side. The leaders who doubted him, the young delegates who believed in him, the millions of people across India who would hear of this day.